Welcome everyone. This is Josh from Big Slicks Anything and Everything, the horror edition, and this is part 2 of our Magnificent 7 of horror series. This one focuses, of course, the Magnificent 7 favorite men heroes of horror. There, of course, we oftentimes in modern times all think of the final girls, but there's also been quite a few of the final guys as well, and these are amongst my favorite, though I hesitate to use final guys because not all my favorites actually make it to the end of several of these movies. Once again, this isn't necessarily in any particular list, it just happens to be my 7th favorite, though my very last one is certainly my favorite, but the rest of them from 2 to 7 could be in any order, and this is of course my personal favorites. That's why I always hesitate to say the best, because that's purely subjective. So let's get on with it. First, we'll go ahead and talk about our honorable mentions. Now, on the far left, now these two, you might kind of be a little bit wary whether or not they're really horror or not, but there's obviously Tennessee, played by Woody Harrelson in Zombieland. Some people will look at this more as an action comedy, but there's certainly plenty of elements of horror, because after all, we are talking about zombies, and the great thing about horror, there's so many different subgenres and so many different types of horror out there that it's a big tent, let's say. And that brings us to another favorite character, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dutch in Predator. Now, a lot of people think of Predator as a sci-fi action film, but it's certainly a lot of horror elements. We're talking about a creature that you cannot see that is stalking you and wants to basically rip your spine and skull out to keep as its trophy. Sounds pretty horrific to me, if you ask me. Then, of course, there's the legendary Max von Sydow as Father Merrin in The Exorcist. And speaking of Max von Sydow, he would later go from fighting demons to portraying the devil in a very underrated Stephen King adaptation, Needful Things, which brings us to Ed Harris as Sheriff Alan Pangborn in Needful Things, another great character that I've always been a big favorite of mine. So now let's get to my top 7. This brings up the 2 very iconic characters throughout the history of horror. We, of course, have Dr. Sam Loomis in the Halloween series, of course, mostly played by Donald Pleasence in the early films from parts 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. Of course, later on, Malcolm McDowell would reprise the role in the Rob Zombie versions, and I liked his performance, but let's face it, it's Donald Pleasence that we always think of when we think of playing that role of Dr. Loomis. Definitely the backbone of that series, and I think it's something that was missing with the more recent Halloween films. There was no Dr. Loomis, and sometimes that takes away from the movies themselves. And then also one of the really OGs of male heroes in horror, and that's the character of Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who's been played by several actors throughout the different versions of Dracula, from Edward Van Sloan from the 1931 classic that also, of course, starred Bela Lugosi. We had Sir Laurence Olivier portrayal, and then my close second favorite version of Van Helsing, Sir Anthony Hopkins himself in the 92 version. Heck, even Hugh Jackman played Van Helsing in the action horror film Van Helsing. But my very favorite has got to be Peter Cushing, who of course portrayed the character in 1958's Horror of Dracula. Oh, he's a great actor, and it was a great role for him as he played opposite of Christopher Lee, as he did in several movies during the Hammer horror era. I put both these characters on the same slide because they're very similar. They're like the one character in these movies that really truly understands what it is what the evil is. They both understand it, and as usual, a lot of people at first don't believe them when they tell them who Michael Myers is and what a danger he is. In the case of Loomis, in the case of Van Helsing, what Dracula is. The difference between these two is Van Helsing knows how to defeat Dracula, Loomis oftentimes doesn't know how to defeat Michael. He almost even admits it in a scene in Halloween 4 when he's trying to get Jamie to safety when they're running through the abandoned school, and Jamie asks Loomis, will this, something along the lines of, will we be safe? And Loomis goes, oh yeah, sure. And then she goes, you really don't believe that, do you? And Loomis goes, no. Loomis doesn't know how to defeat Michael, but it doesn't stop him from trying, and it's what makes both these two great classic characters and among my favorites. And then I'd be remiss to talk about male heroes in horror if I didn't talk about Ash, played brilliantly by the wonderful Bruce Campbell, and of course in the Evil Dead series. I mean, the line says it all when he says, hello to my boomstick. We're talking about a guy that in Evil Dead Part 2 had to cut off his possessed hand and replace it with a chainsaw. That says it all. There probably aren't too many horror villains that Ash couldn't defeat, whether it's the Deadites in Evil Dead or any other villains. If you put them up against, I think he'd probably take them. And then another one of my favorites, who's always, I think, a very underrated horror movie and a very underrated character, is James Woods as Jack Crow in John Carpenter's Vampires. Love this character, and it's no secret that John Carpenter's Vampires is easily my favorite horror movie of the 90s. This movie came out in 98 in the middle of the whole era of horror that I didn't particularly like, as horror movies around that time were becoming too clean, too nice looking, and this was a dirty, gritty horror film with a real strong Western feeling to it. And this character that James Woods plays is just freaking a total badass. I mean, I loved how he hammed it up throughout the entire movie. This guy who doesn't give a shit one way or another. Even when he's getting threatened to be burned alive, he's still talking shit to the main villain, Valak, the head vampire. I love that character, and once again, a great movie. And if you haven't checked out John Carpenter's Vampires, please do so. It's a great movie and very underrated film under John Carpenter's great group of different movies that he's done. Then on to the next scenes. We, of course, have another great John Carpenter character from another great John Carpenter movie, and that's the role of MacReady, played by Kurt Russell in The Thing. The Thing's probably my third favorite horror movie of all time, right behind Jaws and the original Halloween. This character, I mean, it says it all. He's just a no-nonsense, no bullshit type of guy who really doesn't give a fuck when it comes right down to it. The line that really best personifies this character is towards the end of the movie, when MacReady's confronting the Thing in its actual form, just looks at it and says, yeah, well, fuck you too, as he throws a stick of dynamite at it. It's the perfect role for the perfect actor in the perfect movie. Love that role. And then that comes down to another character I really love from maybe one of the greatest movies ever made, and that's Chief Brody, played by Roy Scheider in Jaws. The line says it all there in the caption, you're going to need a bigger boat. I think what I really love about this character is how in a lot of ways I see myself in this character. This character hates the water, yet he lives on an island, and that's certainly something I would do. He's just a guy, he's the small town sheriff of this summer town, and he's just trying to protect the community and protect his family. He's a guy who oftentimes finds himself out of his element, but in the end, he's the one that ends up killing the shark. So, yeah, great character, once again, in one of the best movies ever made, not just in horror, but in any genre, really. But speaking of Jaws, that brings us to my absolute favorite character, favorite male hero in any horror movie, and that, of course, would be none other than the legendary Robert Shaw as Quint, also in the movie Jaws. Whereas Brody's the guy I'd certainly identify as being, Quint's the guy I would really want to be. This is probably, and of course, this is why he's definitely not a final guy in this, because he doesn't live at the end. As we know, he gets pretty much chewed up, eaten alive by the shark. But this is such a great character. it's probably my favorite character of any movie, really. One of the greatest performances ever by the late Robert Shaw, and how the hell he didn't win an Oscar for this performance is beyond me. Certainly the scene of dialogue where he's talking about his experiences serving on the USS Indianapolis, which is a true life story. Of course, he recited this whole scene of dialogue totally drunk anyway, as legend would have it. Love this character. This is a much more complex character than you would think. At first you think he's just in it for the money, which in a lot of ways he is, as him, Hooper, and Brody are hunting the shark. But we start finding out more that this is certainly a personal vendetta he has against sharks in general, and that kind of humanizes the character a little bit. But yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite characters and one of the best performances ever, not just in horror but in any other movie. So please, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and feel free to leave in the comments section your favorite male heroes in horror movies. The next video I end up doing will be talking about the child actors in horror, and child characters I should say, in the horror genre, as I'll be talking about my favorites. So until then, thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.